Welcome to the 3 Knockdown Rule. Starring Mario Lopez and Steve Kim. Presented by Hustler Casino.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 3 Knockdown Rule is in effect, an evergreen edition brought to you by Hustler Casino. I'm Steve Kim, and my co-host, the Buffalo Soldier, Mario Lopez.
Gotta explain that. I just must look. Let me try this again. I must compliment you on your wig. It's looking extra nice today.
Thank you.
And it's working with the baseball shirt. Either I'm in a good mood, my eyes are foggy, or you're just looking particularly nice.
I'm looking like Asian Jimmy Johnson here. You know, of course, we got to mention Smokin' Tim Frazier. The bout sheet is very simple. It's an evergreen edition. We are going to be talking at length to the author of It Happened and the legend himself who's going to return ringside. We'll talk about that with Jim Lampley, but we want to let you know this podcast is sponsored by Hustler Casino, open 24/7 and located just 15 minutes from downtown LA. If you love poker, then head over to Hustler Casino for the new Cash is King poker cash drawings happening every Monday. They're giving away a whopping $1,000 cash every other hour from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. Play at Hustler Casino, located just 15 minutes from downtown LA if you want to win big. All right, when we come back, joined by the legendary Jim Lampley.
Streaming live right on YouTube.
Welcome to the big leagues, kid.
$1.2 million.
And I'm losing in this fucking game. What the fuck?
There's a 400K flip. If I win by the way, you get 10 grand.
Fucking straddle!
For my fans!
What? I read it twice!
Wow. All in a call.
I'm not fucking leaving!
Raise it up.
And we're back on the 3 Knockdown Rule. And Mario, I'll let you do the intro. A regular to the 3 Knockdown Rule, one of our favorites.
One of my favorites. I mean, I've already told you, he's the one I always look forward to talking to the most because we can continue to chat with him for hours. But we've got him for a bit today. The legend, Mr. Jim Lampley. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Mario, and I'm great, Steve. I pay equal attention to both, 50-50. And thank you very much for the glorious introduction. And what better way to spend a Friday afternoon in Chapel Hill?
Congratulations on your new book, and no shocker here, it's fantastic, and you, sir, know how to tell a story, and so many wonderful ones. We're just going to try to touch on a few, but before we even get into that, why was now the perfect time to kind of dive into this memoir, Jim?
Why was now the perfect time to dive into the book?
Yes, sir.
Because once HBO boxing went away and once no streaming service reached out to hire me to do blow by blow in the wake of HBO's departure from the scene, and once I got tired of teaching undergraduates things they didn't want to hear here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, then the next question was, okay, what are you going to do? And I had always known, being the child and the grandchild of devoted storytellers, that at some point I would probably try to tell this unusual and highly counterintuitive story of my life. So I sat down and began the process of trying to write a book. Not at first thinking that I would actually be able to do so, because it felt like the kind of task that I would begin and not finish. And then at the end of the day, I woke up one morning and said, "Hey, I think I've come pretty close here to writing a book." And my as told to author said, "Oh, trust me, you have written a book," and so we, went forward, and now it publishes on April 15th.
Yeah, and Jim, I've always wondered this because as a guy that's a reporter, I mean, I just have deadlines and a game or a fight happens, I write about it or I have a schedule. What is the process that at least you went through? How do you put together a book, organize everything, and then actually schedule out whatever the chapters are? What was your process?
To underline credit for myself, Steve, I should probably go ahead and play your game and give you all sorts of answers that relate to the fictitious notion that I would have sat down and written an outline and organized my approach to the book. That is not what I did. I wrote a first chapter as I saw it, and then coming off of writing that part of it, getting into the narrative the way I thought I should get into the narrative, then I would go upstairs and go to bed in my bed and lie awake at night before I fell asleep thinking about what I was going to write the next day. And I would try to memorize some phrases and some markers to put within the copy that I thought belonged there, etc. And then I would go downstairs the next morning and write. And so I never had a written outline. I never had any legitimately structured approach to writing what I wrote. I was doing, in essence, what my mother and my grandmother both did with me when they would stand in the kitchen preparing dinner or lunch or whatever and begin telling stories and just keep going. And when the book was finally finished and my wife, Deborah, read it, she said, "How do you explain how it is that you start something and then digress into something else and then come back around the far end and get back to where you were and somehow complete a narrative in such a way that it sort of makes sense? How did you do that?" And I said, "That's what my grandmother and my mother did. That's the way they told stories. It was instinctive. It was naturalistic. It was the way they did it. And it's the way that it is stuck in my head." And, let's face it, television, if you do it, you know this, Mario, it's anecdotal. You can't tell the entire story in one sitting. You're going to be breaking it up somehow or another. There are commercial breaks. There are natural narrative steps forward, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of reasons why you tell a television story in pieces. You tell the blow-by-blow of a boxing match in pieces, round by round. I told my life story in the book in pieces, and people who have read it tell me that it fits together pretty well.
Jim, having read this book, and I just absolutely tore through it, you put it all out there, but was there anything that was so dark that you said, you know what, I don't need to put this in the book? Is there anything that you said, nah, I'm good?
Yeah.
That's why he's not going to mention it now, Kim.
Yeah, I think I dishonored myself enough to look honest, and I did not want to dishonor myself any further than to appear to demonstrate that I was looking honest.
Yes, well put.
Yes,
I like that. I want to dive into some of the stories, Jim, and there's so many. But for example, I want to start with going to Ali listing. The tickets were like $100, $150. Your mom just dropped you off.
Yeah,
that's such a random.
It was a different.
My mom was selling life insurance to earn a living. My brother was away at a prep school in Western North Carolina. My half brother, technically. I was almost every day alone in the house from the moment I arrived home from school until I went to bed before she came home from door-to-door life insurance selling. And so to a large degree, my life was my own. And I read in either the Miami Herald or the Miami News that if Cassius Clay fought Sonny Liston sometime early in 1964, that fight would probably take place in Miami Beach. And I began mowing lawns and car washing to save up money to try to buy a ticket for Cassius Clay versus Sonny Liston, because Cassius Clay was already my very clearly defined most important hero in life. and I needed to see that fight, and I had never been to a live prize fight. Now, one thing that's interesting about this, just as a piece of trivia, you both know who the Colonel, Bob Sheridan, was, right?
Yes.
And who called more fights in his lifetime than Jim Lampley did? Bob Sheridan did, because he was calling all of these, lesser cards, et cetera, and Top Rank and all. And Bob clearly called more fights than I did. The very first live prize fight I ever attended, February 25, 1964 in Miami Beach, was also the very first live prize fight that Bob Sheridan ever attended. Okay. Wow. So that is a coincidental link in the lives of arguably the two most widely exposed play-by-play men of their generation. They both went to that same fight, February 25, 1964, when they had never been to one before.
Wow.
If you think about it, $100 to $150, if you adjust for inflation, has to be about what, $700-800 today.
At least, and I don't remember exactly what I paid for the ticket. Nor, of course, was I smart enough at that moment in time, pre-internet, pre all sorts of other things in our current existence. I wasn't smart enough to save the ticket, to save the stub, et cetera, et cetera. Heaven only knows what that would be worth now.
I know.
And, I think I still have my credential from Tokyo, but I didn't save that one. And I do distinctly remember, as I noted later on in the book, I'm in the late rounds of Mike Tyson versus Buster Douglas in Tokyo, and I'm very graphically thinking to myself, oh my gosh, the first live prize fight I ever attended was the biggest upset in the history of boxing. And now I am calling for the American audience the fight which will succeed it as the biggest upset in the history of boxing. I didn't write my life story. Somebody else did. Some higher power.
Now, the picture where I believe it's the second fight with Ali enlisting, where you see Larry Merchant in the back.
Yeah, that was in Maine.
That was the second one.
Yeah, Lewiston, Maine.
Yeah, Lewiston, exactly. And then Merchant, of course, you ended up working with for
between Cassius's legs.
Exactly.
Okay.
Between his
or Muhammad's legs. By that point, we call it Muhammad's legs. Right. Between Muhammad's legs, there's Larry with the jaw dropped,
right,
wide open mouth, a very definitive Larry Merchant expression. He was so young and handsome at that time. He was charismatic, etc. So it's an amazing photo. And there's an AP writer seated at ringside who's between Larry and the camera. That guy's name, I think, was Dave Berg. But Larry had actually stood up so that his head is above Berg's, and the drop jaw expression is so perfectly definitively Larry. It's just it's truly gripping to look at that.
Yeah, Larry at his old house in his office actually had that picture framed. There was a part of it
given to him by Neil Leifer.
Oh yeah,
and Neil Leifer was the most celebrated sports photographer of that generation, along with another Sports Illustrated guy named Hans Klutmeyer. Take your pick, which one was better, but that was one of Neil's absolutely definitive photographs.
Jim, moving along, I thought one of the other great stories of the book was your reaction when you're interviewing for the college football sideline reporting job. It's a coveted role. 100 people are there. The odds are stacked against you. I just love your reaction. When you were recounting this story, did you wince at just how arrogant you were as a young guy?
Gosh. Well, Terry Jastrow was straight out of Central Casting for a University of Houston scholarship golfer from the money factory of West Texas, Midland, Texas. His father was in the oil business. So, Terry was spit and polished, perfect, et cetera, et cetera. And when he begins, and I've sat there for hours waiting to get in. I'm 34th out of 36 among the, spit and polished kids in that room. I'm the only one who's 25. I'm the only one who's a graduate student. I'm clearly not going to be chosen. I don't fit any of the qualifications they're suggesting. And I've had a few hours on a 96-degree day in Birmingham to get pretty angry about it. So I go into the room, and Jastrow looks at me before Ebersol ever says a word. Jastrow looks at me and says, what do you think of our idea here? What do you think of what we're doing? And I said, let me get this straight. You're going around the country and you're going to interview more than 400 people like me. And from that selection of people, you're going to choose the face and voice of the American college student. And there's no answer. They're both just sitting there like, yeah. And I said, I think it's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of in my life. I can't believe I drove 8 hours from Chapel Hill to be here. I can't believe I now have to turn around and drive back. It's a complete waste of my time. And that's what I think of it. And that's when they wrote down, Ebersol was the one who wrote down arrogant, alienated, abrasive, antagonistic, which became known in the football truck as the 4 A's. Every time I did something obstreperous or made myself difficult on the sideline, the director, Andy Sedaris, would turn to Chuck Howard, the producer, and say, there it is, the 4 A's. That's who he is. That's who we chose.
The 4 A's, though, somehow complement and elevate the status of the host itself.
And by the way, to all the younger viewers out there that want to get into this business, generally the Lampley approach probably will not land you the job, so it's probably not recommended.
Not what I recommend.
Yeah.
Those are not the words you're looking for on the evaluation form, but it worked.
So, ABC obviously being a huge part of your life. Roone Arledge, would you say is the most important person in your professional life, your professional young life at least?
Oh yeah, because absolutely, because without Roone Arledge and his particular instincts and decision process, I don't get past that initial encounter with ABC Sports. It was after they had interviewed 432 people at screening interviews around the country. It was after they had come back to New York to begin trying to boil the process down. It was after they had already sent several of the candidates out to do videotape auditions or film auditions, as it were, in that particular day and age. Only then did Roone send for his assistant Ebersol and say, by the way, I'm just wondering, now that I've looked at these auditions, is there anybody that you interviewed who actually did have on-camera experience and background? And Ebersol said, yeah, there was one. There was this guy from Chapel Hill who was older than the rest and had a lot of on-air experience, and we discarded him. And Roone said, well, let me see him. And that's when they sent me to do an audition interview. And without having any idea what they were doing, they sent me to interview George Myra, a former University of Miami quarterback who had been one of my adolescent boyhood heroes. And I still had a number 10 George Myra Miami jersey hanging in my closet in Chapel Hill at the moment they sent me to do that interview. And I can very distinctly remember sitting down to the interview and thinking, I know more about him than members of his family know. I know more about him than anybody else they could possibly choose to do this interview. So I showed it off. I did a 15 or 20 minute interview, which was based on all of my background knowledge. And Arledge took a look at it and said, look at that. I didn't see that from anybody else I don't know how he did this, but look at that. He knows everything about the guy. Well, that was a pure accident.
So you graduate to the desk, and I remember watching you would do hundreds of scores in like 2 minutes, but I had completely forgotten your co-host was a guy that I love because being a college football fanatic, the cantankerous Beano Cook. Was he that big of a funny guy off the camera?
Well, he was one of a kind, and his reputation, the widely spread reputation, had actually begun with a moment when he was the sports information director at the University of Pittsburgh. Yeah. And he fielded a call in his office one night and it was a woman's voice. And the woman said, I want to talk to somebody who can explain to me the University of Pittsburgh football roster. And he said, well, I can do that. I'm the person who compiles the University of Pittsburgh football roster. And she said, well, I want to have sex with every player on the roster. How can I arrange that?
That's ambitious.
And at that moment, he said, all right, I'll give you the names. 1, Cook. Carol, Cooke. I don't know the rest of the story from there, but I do know that Bino was very proud of telling that particular part of it. And yeah, he was unique and unusual. And there's a little anecdote in the book that describes the uniqueness in its own way.
Yeah, well, my favorite Bino Cook story is he was not a baseball fan, and when Bowie Kuhn promised all the Iranian hostages as they were released season tickets to their favorite Major League Baseball team, Bino Cook blurted out,
"Haven't they suffered enough?"
That's a great line, though.
Haven't they suffered enough? Bino had a wonderful, snarky, sarcastic sense of humor. And by the way, not only was he not a baseball fan, he wasn't a fan of any other sport other than college football. It was all college football for Bino, and mostly Notre Dame. By the way, he was one of the. It was ironic that he was the SID at Pittsburgh, because deep in his heart he was really only a Notre Dame fan, and he knew all of that lore and all of the history and the background and all of the stories relative to Notre Dame. But he was the SID at Pitt. Go figure.
Yeah, he actually famously said Ron Powless will win 2 Heismans at Notre Dame. He only came up 2 short. Jim, reading the book, it actually got me on a little bit of a deep dive. I started watching some of the documentaries on the Miracle on Ice, U.S. defeating Russia in the 1980 Olympics, that famous game. And it got me thinking, you were at that game live, and also Tyson Douglas. I've wanted to ask you this for a while. If you could go back in a time machine and you only had one ticket where you can go back to either one, which one would you choose?
Well, Douglas Tyson in Tokyo is a very weird day, because you can remember that the Japanese audience was so quiet you could hear a pin drop.
Made it eerie watching.
Yeah. It was very eerie. It was even more eerie, Mario, to sit there.
I can imagine.
And again, I've told the story, and I think I told the story in the book, that Larry and Ray and I wound up speaking in a whisper, as though we were covering a golf tournament. Because how could you make noise the way you would in America when there are 35,000 people sitting silently around you?
Yeah.
And you could hear a pin drop in the arena, to borrow a cliche. But no, it was a bizarre circumstance. So obviously, frankly, if I could go back to either one, I would go back and watch the whole hockey game instead of just, say, the first 5 minutes of the second period on. See the whole hockey game and see the whole thing, how it developed. But I couldn't trade either experience for anything. I don't know of any other sports broadcaster who has 2 such unusual touchstone experiences in his background to go back and think about at night when you're lying in bed and thinking about all the things that happened in your career. The way I saw the Miracle on Ice, the way I saw Tyson Douglas, and oh, by the way, even before those things, did you read the Franz Klammer section?
Yes.
Did it make you want to go back to YouTube and get the video of Klammer's downhill and see, all the things that I describe in that particular moment in time?
Jim, you taught me something about skiing. I'm not really a big skiing guy, but I didn't realize that the later you run, the disadvantage that you have because of what happens to the snow.
Right.
Right. And particularly on a very warm, sunny day in Innsbruck. And I'll never forget the tingling that I felt when Klammer told me, 20 years later, I had to choose to ski the wrong line because I knew it was my only chance. It might kill me, but it might win the gold medal. And he won the gold medal.
Is that your most memorable Olympic experience out of all of the Olympic experiences?
100%. And I wound up going to 14 Olympics, and I went to all sorts of other things. No, that's not the most memorable. The most memorable is the Miracle on Ice. The second most memorable is Klammer's downhill. And the reason for that is you can see the Miracle on Ice. You're watching it right in front of you. But as I said in that section of the book, you don't really see a downhill ski race. You feel it. You're there on the mountain, you hear the crowd, you get a sense for everybody's response, et cetera, and you feel what happened as far as seeing the run, a skier goes by you.
Right.
And then another skier goes by you.
Like Formula One.
Yeah. And unless you're at the bottom of the hill, right next to the finish line, that's all you see. And we were farther up the hill, so that was all I saw.
One more thing a couple more things about your days at ABC. I have to ask you, because the Cosell chapter, I don't want to give it away, but it made me laugh. I actually reread it because I started reading it in his voice, every quote that you had from. Did he ever pay you a compliment that was sincere?
Yes, but he didn't pay it to me. The sincere compliments, as close as he could get to that, were the things he said to the secretaries that I would hear down the hall because of the trombone voice, and then that was when he would say, and it wasn't really so much a compliment to me as it was a disparagement to everybody else on the announcing staff. The kid, Lampley, is the only other one here capable of completing a complex sentence. None of those other morons have any acuity whatsoever in dealing with the language. He at least knows the difference between an adjective and an adverb, and you can hear it in the way that he speaks. So, yes, he gave me compliments, but he would never have said that if he had known that I was listening or could hear it.
It's more impressive to hear it secondhand.
Right. And so, Jim, to wrap it up here, I have always found it amazing because many people believe that there's no doubt about it. You are on the Mount Rushmore of boxing blow-by-blow guys, if not the greatest.
Absolutely. In my book, already, if the Mount Rushmore is the George Washington.
Right. But Dennis Swanson, when he took over, thought he was punishing you and getting you out of there by, quote-unquote, relegating you to boxing.
Which is why the book is so important, because the book very categorically makes the point that the first sports event my mother ever sat me down to watch after my father died when I was 5 years old was Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship of the world. And people used to ask me, because of my ABC genesis, people used to ask me, was Cosell the voice you heard in your head when you were doing blow by blow? Were you channeling him? No, Don Dunphy. I listened to Don Dunphy call 100 fights before I ever heard Howard Cosell call a fight. And I never, ever thought for even a moment that Howard was in the same league with Don Dunphy. So I wanted to do that same kind of precise, categorical, relatively less dramatic, repertorial fact-based call of a fight that Dunphy gave us in his day, and to me, he's still the greatest. And I think that Barry Tompkins would say Dunphy was the greatest too. And there are some other people who would say Jim Lampley, but they are of a later vintage. They didn't hear Dunphy.
Funny that you mentioned Dennis Swanson. I happen to be friends with his son, Eric Swanson.
Oh, yeah.
You know Eric Swanson.
I didn't know that was his father.
Yeah, that's his father. That's his father. I mean, his father as well. I want to go back to again, ABC for a second, and through your Monday Night Football travels, you got to know OJ Simpson
very well
too. And as far as him being this beloved figure and then transitioning into this pariah, it's one of those things it's not like you could ever see something like this coming, but were there ever signs of an individual that maybe it
go wayward?
Yeah, it could go wayward.
An absence of judgment, you mean?
Yeah, well, like you never.
First of all, okay. Could I have ever dreamed that my very beloved dear friend could get out of a car with a knife in his hand and go cut two people up? No, that was not something that would ever have occurred to me. Do I believe that there were certain extracurricular stimuli that figured into that? Yes, I do believe that. Do I have factual evidence to prove it? No, because the police didn't generate the kind of factual evidence they would have needed to prove that kind of thing. But the one thing that I point out in the book and that I want to make very clear to everybody is, regardless of what you think of him now, and what you think of him now is colored by the absolutely inescapable evidence that he murdered two people. All right, I'm not in the Don Ohlmeyer, Al Michaels framework where I'm still clinging to the notion that my friend couldn't have done that. That was never me. It was clear to me. But I say in the book, and I want to say again to you guys because of your audience, if you were in the Hollywood elite in those days, if you had any currency whatsoever with the party going, Melrose Avenue eating crowd of Hollywood people, OJ was the one who remembered your birthday, remembered your wedding anniversary, remembered you on Christmas. If OJ had stock in Miss Grace's lemon cakes or honey baked hams, you received one of those at every meaningful occasion in your life. He, obviously he had assistants, he had a staff of people who helped him with that, but OJ was overtly thoughtful and overtly loving and friendly. He was your best friend among the entire group, and I will never think of what ultimately happened without enormous regret for him, obviously for Nicole, for the children, but for all of us who cared about him too. It was devastating to have to go through it, and it still hurts me to this day. And that's all I can say about it. I just will never completely get over that. And it's in the book that after the end of my first college football season, the next thing I did for ABC Sports that was designed to show me that I was going forward, that I was going to keep working there, was to be a feature reporter on superstars in Rotunda, Florida. And I went down to Rotunda, Florida, where the feature reporters were me, Billie Jean, and OJ. And on the first night, the whole telecast group went out to dinner. And OJ said, as we were leaving dinner, do you want to go get a beer? And I went, and we spent an hour and a half in the bar talking about his life, talking about my life. And I can never, ever forget the vibration in me that night. When I went back to my room and lay down to go to sleep and thought to myself, I'm friends with OJ Simpson. I'm friends with him. This is 1974. This is not that far removed from him winning the Heisman Trophy. And in order for people to understand how big he was, in 1968, I believe it is, 67 or 68, Sports Illustrated magazine did a special issue on the first 100 years of college football. And it was all about from the beginning of college football in the 19th century on through to college football that day. And they chose as the greatest player of the first 100 years in college football, OJ Simpson.
Yeah. Wow.
And their rationale for it was, we don't know what Bronco Nagurski or Red Grange would have done on national television with all the money behind it that exists now in a game for the national championship against UCLA. We know what OJ did. He went 67 yards running through the entire UCLA defense to win that national championship. And that was their rationale for picking him as the greatest player of the first 100 years.
Mario, anytime I talk to anyone that's a little older than me, they say, Steve, you think Michael Jordan was big in the 80s? OJ was probably his equal in the 70s with the Hertz commercials and everything else. I mean, he really set the bar for a lot of athletes getting endorsements.
Well, bigger because the media landscape was so much more crowded when Jordan came along. Right. OJ was in a much less crowded media landscape, and there was one of him. Only one.
Jim, my final question to you is this, because I'm reading the book, and I had completely forgotten your role at KMPC 710. I have dinner with Doug Krikorian about once a month, and you were part of that roster. You were a forerunner to that whole genre. And the thing that's interesting is me as a kid watching you, I've seen every stage of your career as a fan, that I've gotten to know you. And here I'm thinking, man, Jim Lampley is a titan. He's made it. ABC, NBC, it doesn't matter. Everything he does is a hit. HBO, and then also, but reading this book, that came at a cost personally. As you wrote the book, or as you look back, do you ever say to yourself, you know what? I was better off not working so much all the time and maybe focusing more on my personal life. Did those thoughts ever come into your head?
100%. I was moving too fast. I was hearing too many yes answers. I was meeting too many women who wanted a piece of that action. There were all sorts of things that I allowed to go wrong, and where I was misguided. And the only people to whom I would apologize for that are my children. I put my children through discomforts that they should never have experienced because of my inability to manage that part of my career. And oh, by the way, I pay nothing but credit to people like, most specifically, my good friends Bob Costas and Jim Nance, who did far better jobs of managing their personal lives in such a way as to coalesce with their professional lives and keep things going on a coherent plane. I did not have a coherent plane. And part of that was Hollywood. Part of that was my friendship set. Part of that was all the things that we've been discussing, but I didn't have a coherent plane, and I wasn't as good at managing my life as Bob and Jim, and I congratulate them both for being better.
That's very cool of you to mention that, but I can understand and sympathize with you exactly what you're saying, because the balance is tough. And also in this business, you don't know, everything's a temp job too. You don't know necessarily when, so you kind of have that attitude. You want to strike while the iron's hot, continue the momentum. Yeah. But your significant other doesn't always understand that, and it's very difficult unless they're in the industry themselves, and you want to build for your family, but at the same time, you not being there present. It's tough, Jim. So I get it, because I've struggled personally.
And by the way, Mario, you're one of the 3 or 4 handsomest men in the world. All right. So it has been even more difficult for you. All right. Because of the sheer glamour that goes with the way you look. I look pretty good, but not like you. So I understand completely.
Jim, I was watching a lot of the past HBO broadcasts. Your hair at one time was elite. Okay, let's just keep it.
Not now.
Before we wrap it up here, hold on. You will be back ringside, though.
Yes.
Don't call it a comeback, right?
Yep. I'm going to be back ringside May 2, and we're going to find out if I can still call fights.
Absolutely.
I don't get any real practice. I'm going to find out if I can still call fights, and I'm very, very excited about it, and I'm very grateful to Turki Al-Sheikh, and I can't wait to be outside calling a fight on May 2. And when you think of all the things that have happened outside in boxing, from Sullivan Kilrain in the swamps of Mississippi to Jack Johnson versus Jess Willard outdoors in Havana, to the night in Yankee Stadium when a towel was thrown in from Yuri Foreman's corner against Miguel Cotto, and Arthur McCanty Jr. picked it up and threw it back out of the ring. I mean, so many bizarre things have taken place outdoors that I can't wait to see what happens in these fights.
Well, one of the greatest boxing announcers ever, and according to Tennis Magazine, the worst tennis announcer ever. At least in the beginning, you got better on HBO.
the worst tennis announcer that year, and I would have agreed with them. Yes.
Well, Jim, look, it's always a pleasure. We cannot wait to hear you back doing what you do best. And again, you always have an open invite on the 3 Knockdown Rule.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your time.
And congratulations.
Get ready to have me every week, because I love being here with you. But yes, it's a thrill to be coming back to do Blow by Blow, and it's a thrill to spend another hour on the 3 Knockdown Rule.
All right, Jim, thank you, and we'll be seeing you soon. And we'll be back with more of the 3 Knockdown Rule.
What's up, guys? Mystic Zach here, back to give my predictions on the 3 Knockdown Rule. Done 2 picks so far, 2-0, off to a good start. This week I've got 2 more picks for you. It all starts with a heavyweight bout. Filip Hrgović taking on Joe Joyce. Both these guys coming off of losses. For Hrgović, it was his career first. He suffered a defeat to Daniel Dubois. No shame in that, but still something to be noted. On the other side, Joe Joyce has lost 3 of his last 4, and his last fight lost an absolute war to a warrior in Derek Chisora. Also, no shame in that. The question is, for the pundits and the fans out there, who's going to recover better from that loss? I think it's the younger man of Filip Hrgović. Only 32 years old to Joyce's 39. Hrgović, I think, too fast and too much for Joe Joyce in this matchup. He's going to start fast like he always does. I see him putting it on Joyce, who doesn't have the defense to really contend. with a guy like Philip Hrgović, at least in my opinion. The next pick, Tim Tszyu, coming off of 2 losses, taking on Joey Spencer. This fight's in his native Australia, where him, his father Costa, and his brother Nikita are a combined 50-0. I think that streak continues. I think they go to 51-0. The reason why I think that, when I watch Joey Spencer, I think he has too many defensive holds for Tim Tszyu to take advantage of. Specifically his footwork. I think he's too stiff, too easy for Tim Tszyu to hit, and I think it's going to be a long night for Spencer. And I think Tim Tszyu gets back in the win column. I'm Mr. Zach. Those are my 2 picks of the week. I've got Philip Hrgović and Tim Tszyu.
And we're back on the 3 Knockdown Rule, brought to you by Hustler Casino. Hey, folks, if you're looking to get involved with 3 Knockdown Rule and sponsor our show, we have some spots available. Please email us at info@boxbid.io. Once again, that's info@boxbid.io. Boxbid is an online platform that helps professional boxers connect with their fans by providing exclusive Fight Week merchandise, memorabilia, and sponsorships. You can even buy a shout-out on Boxbid. Boxbid.io handles our sponsorships, and we are proudly working with Boxbid.io. Mario, always a captivating and interesting conversation with the one and only Lamps.
One of my all-time favorite guests.
Yeah.
He's definitely on the Mount Rushmore, and he's the kind of guy you can talk to for hours if you had the time, which unfortunately we don't. But look forward to having him back because, there's going to be more stories.
And certainly It Happened was a very, very interesting read, went right through it. And Mario, as most people are watching this, you will still be in Buffalo, quote unquote, on assignment.
I will. Buffalo, New York, way out there. Couldn't be further from L.A. here.
How are you here and there?
Yeah.
I've learned AI works wonders.
Yeah.
No, I'll be shooting my holiday film out there. It's not going to be as brutally cold as it was in Chicago. You would think Buffalo would be even colder, right? But it's my first time to be spending a significant amount of time out there. I like it. It's really nice. It's really close to Niagara Falls. Obviously, the chicken wings, famous there. They're beef on wax sandwiches. And they're really rolling out the red carpet for us. So I'm looking forward to having a good time. And then I'll come back ready to go.
Is this Christmas movie number 14?
Gosh, I haven't kept.
Because you might lead the league.
I haven't. Well,
you might lead the league.
I've been pretty consistent with it. New York Post did call me KOC, King of Christmas.
Yeah.
A while ago. Remember that, Frazier?
Yeah.
So that was cool.
So during this time, we brought you evergreen shows with Doug Fisher of Ring Magazine and Jim Lampley. We'll take 1 week off. Then in the middle of April, we're right back at it. We'll have a lot of boxing to discuss.
A lot of boxing, and we'll dive right into everything and be all over it as usual.
All right, so that's it for this edition of the 3 Knockdown Rule, brought to you by Hustler Casino.